will get underway. And the first thing to say is that I'm very pleased that we've got George Peretz with us this evening, George Peretz QC. Just before I run through his CV, I would like to say that Gopal Subramaniam, who is due to join us this evening as well, unfortunately, having flown back from India, had found on arrival that he had lost his voice. So he emailed me this morning to say he'd lost his voice, and therefore a webinar unfortunately was excluded, but he has promised to come back as soon as it can be arranged. So there will be a further webinar on the subject of the Constitution. And what we might try to do is arrange for him to be on a panel with one of the people who is heavily involved in the process of drafting the Chilean Constitution, who we are hoping to secure for a webinar in February. So watch this space, and I apologize, and so does Gopal, that he's not able to join us. But as I said, we're very fortunate in having George Peretz QC with us this evening. George has advised and represented the UK government on a wide range of major EU and public law cases, including many cases in the European Court of Justice and higher English courts. He was appointed a Queen's Counsel in 2015, is joint chair of the Joint Working Party of UK Bars and Law Societies on Competition Law and joint convener of the UK State Aid Law Association, and was also the general rapporteur of the Ligue Internationale du Droit de la Concurrence. George has written widely on the subject of Brexit and was also called to the Irish Bar in 2018. So we might find some references to the Irish Constitution being deployed later on in response to some of the questions that I'm going to put to George. But before we get to those, a few words about Unlock Democracy. Hopefully the fact that people are on this call means that they know who we are. We are an organisation that has as its unique selling point trying to secure a written constitution for the United Kingdom, but we also campaign on a number of other issues such as transparency and accountability of government. So as you will have realised, today has been quite a busy day for us on that front, in that Sue Gray's report, or perhaps non-report, has been published today, and with all the ensuing questions about what happens next on that front. And again, I suspect that what has happened today might come up in questions later on about how a written constitution might have addressed this or not addressed it. The final thing I would say is that Unlock Democracy and Compass are working on a joint project together called Powering Up. And the purpose of this project is to try to secure a commitment from the political parties to include in their manifestos a wide package of democratic reforms, which would include fair votes, proportional representation, reform in the House of Lords, but also certainly from Unlock Democracy's point of view, we would like to see the commitment to a written constitution in that as well. That's enough from me. Now, just in terms of housekeeping, please do put any questions you've got into the chat. Depending on how we proceed with the questions I'm going to put with George, it may be possible for me to ask people to ask their own questions, or if we are short of time, I may end up asking them for you, but please do put them into the chat. So without further ado, we're going to kick off with perhaps the most obvious question, George, and that is, do you think the UK needs a written constitution?
Well, that's indeed the $1,000 question. I mean, let me put some sort of cards on the table. I mean, one bit of my CV for a start that Tom didn't read out, because the CV you got was somewhat my commercial CV, which I used to attract commercial clients. But one of the things I am also now is a executive member of the Society of Labour Lawyers, so that's my party affiliation. Look, intellectually, I think the case for a written constitution is very strong as a sort of matter of political theory. I recommend an article, if you can, probably a lot of you are already familiar with it, if you haven't come across it already. It's Jeff King's article on the case for a written constitution, which starts from a sort of civic republican perspective that I very much share, that it's in principle, the people should be the authors of their constitution, and that is, intellectually, where I come from. I think in terms of, it seems to me the critical question is how you get to that from here in our current political climate, and whether there's really any feasible route to that. I dare say a lot of you have read Linda Collins' great book on written constitutions, which is, says all sorts of complicated things. But I think one of the themes one gets from that book is that constitutions are often a response to traumas suffered by the state, or becoming independent, I suppose being born as a trauma. But obviously revolution, occupation, the complete destruction of the existing building of the state. Well, in this country, we've never had a complete destruction of the building of the state, and touch wood, we're not going to. At least unless we decide to do it ourselves. So it's always been a question in this country, to keep the building metaphor going, of sort of repairing the roof, adding new extensions, knocking down walls when one wants to make a change. And I think at the moment I find it quite hard to see what the route map is, between that, trying to persuade politicians, who ultimately the people you've got to persuade, to move beyond that exercise of repair, restoration, extension, to trying to design something new in a political climate where, even voters who think that it's a great idea in principle to have a written constitution they've helped write, also want to see government doing practical things about their taxes, about public spending, about the economy, about other types of law reform, and may have not much patience for the idea that you spend an awful lot of political time and energy discussing something slightly abstract. After all, we have just come out of 5 years where politics was about nothing else much than constitutional change, a pretty profound constitutional change at that. One I suspect most people on the call opposed, but that's certainly what it was. And it completely sapped political energy from Westminster and Whitehall, and has left a whole lot of other problems that people had completely unaddressed. That's one of the reasons I was opposed to the whole thing to start with, because it was a pretty shrewd idea that was what was going to happen. But I think from a voter's perspective, if you're going to go down a process of trying to persuade them that we're going to have a huge debate about constitutional reform, you've got to persuade them that that isn't going to happen again, because I don't think anyone found that a very satisfactory exercise. I think that it's also important to be to make the point, as I'm sure you will all have anyway, that a written constitution. There are all sorts of written constitutions. Some of them are awful, some of them are great, some of them are and they all do different things. Certainly in terms of their flexibility. Also, none of them. One hears it sometimes said, wouldn't it be, instead of having conventions, wouldn't it be great if all of these rules were written down and then people would, they would be clear where they stand. That's true up to a point, but remember, quite a lot of our constitution is already written down. It's just not written down in one place, but in all different parts of Acts of Parliament. And also that all constitutions, and certainly true of the Irish Constitution, it's true in spades of the American Constitution, have actually operate through conventions as much as they do words on the text. Indeed, in the United States, that was seen very, very vividly in the whole saga of the allegedly stolen 2020 election and Trump's maneuvers to stay in office. An awful lot of the sort of rules that people were talking about weren't actually things you find in the text of the US Constitution at all. They're simply conventions and understandings about how things should work. The United States is a sort of rather famously terse constitution, much shorter than most. But it's certainly true of other constitutions that I'm reasonably familiar with. The Irish Constitution, French Constitution. There's quite a lot of what actually happens. You struggle actually to find in the text. For example, in the French Constitution, the relationship between the Prime Minister and the President. If you read the text of their powers, you wouldn't actually get what the relationship is between President Macron and, I can't remember, it's actually significant. I can't off the top of my head remember the name of the French Prime Minister, Jean Castex. And because, you know, if you read the Constitution, it looks almost as if the Prime Minister ought to be running things, but he doesn't, never does, when there's a president of the same party. So, the idea that, the written Constitution sort of records into writing every single understanding and invention that we have is, I think, not a realistic one. Sorry, I've gone on for a bit and touched on a number of things, but that's my rather complicated answer to the question.
Thank you very much, George. And let me come back to some of the sort of the questions that you've opened up. You said that you thought it was very hard to see the route map to securing a written constitution and the reasons why politicians might want to embark on that. Can you think, with your Labour affiliations, of why, for instance, any Labour politicians might want to embark on that route of securing a written constitution?
Yeah, I mean, I think I have to say, it's not particularly a conversation I've had with anyone particularly senior about the sort of abstract point. I mean, in general, you'll find the left generally a bit more open to constitutional reform than the right. That's a generalization. There are certainly people on the left who are quite constitutionally conservative and people on the right who are quite willing to make profound constitutional changes. But I mean, as a general rule, you probably find people are more skeptical of our current constitutional arrangements on the left than on the right. I think, I do think that if you talk to most MPs or most people, most shadow cabinet members, and try and interest them in a written constitution, I mean, quite rightly, they ask sort of practical questions about how it's going to be done. If you're talking about, a huge constitutional convention involving lots of politicians, are you talking about doing it through a citizens' assembly? How's that then going to rate? Because at some point, I think it does have to go through a process of involving elected politicians. So how's that going to work? I mean, and when you're doing this, are you starting with a completely clean slate, or is the idea simply to try and sort of to sort of incarnate the current arrangement, making a few tweaks, what lawyers call a consolidating legislation? You'd have a Constitution Act that simply sets out what's already there, or tries to. Don't think that that's necessarily uncontroversial, because one of the issues with our Constitution is precisely that there is some disagreement about how some fairly basic rules work. So actually writing them down will cause some discussion. You may say that's a good thing, it'd be better if they are written down. But it becomes a process which isn't even sort of consolidation exercise, becomes a process that is not free from controversy. And, if you're, it is, I think, a sort of starting question is, are you going to try and stick with the Westminster model, as essentially the Irish did when Eamon de Valera, because he effectively wrote the Irish Constitution single-handed. Eamon de Valera did it in the mid-1930s. They were going to stick with the Westminster model, and that's what one finds. Or are you going to do what de Gaulle did in 1958 and move to a much sort of a different system, a different relationship between the executive and the legislature? What are you going to do about human rights? Are you going to keep the convention as the sole rights instrument? Are you going to sort of tweak it a bit? The current government is in favour of tweaking it a bit. You've been arguing about whether it's the right way or not. Or try and do what Ireland did in 1936 and have a freestanding sort of set of constitutional rights, which Eamon de Valera, under heavy influence of Catholic social thought, wrote into the Irish Constitution. So there's a lot to discuss, and the process of doing it is one that's going to take a lot of political energy and time. And I think it's quite difficult to get politicians interested in that unless they're convinced there's a huge popular demand for it.
And do you have a personal view on whether we should start with in effect, the existing sort of constitutional arrangements, or start with a blank sheet of paper, which is not quite what the Chileans have done, but in some respects is their starting point?
I think I would probably go down something like the Irish route, although I wouldn't get Eamon de Valera to write ours. I mean, one issue which I haven't touched on and which I should have done, because it's really important, of course, is it's one of the drivers to people thinking about all of this is the whole issue of the devolved administrations and what the UK's territorial constitution, as it's sometimes called. And there clearly is the potential. You could say we're already in crisis, but certainly potential for a crisis. You've got obviously an independence movement in Scotland, movement for reunification in Northern Ireland, stirrings in Wales, and of course deep dissatisfaction in England with both to some extent with the devolved settlements, which you hear in as a subtext, sometimes conservative, sometimes not conservative, which sort of grumbles about the extent to which Edinburgh and Cardiff seem to have more powers to do things than Manchester or Leeds. Pressure that's it. So that in England there's sort of grumbling about the position of the devolved nations, and also quite a lot of pressure, of course, for devolution, which is probably going to need to be responded to. I think even the current government, we'll have to see what it says in its levelling up white paper, but after sort of dancing around in a sort of non-committal way the idea of a bit more local democracy, I think they might actually try and say something at any rate in the levelling up white paper. And then you've got the issue of how that, how all of that ties up. Now, one of the problems when you start thinking about what you're going to do in terms of sitting down and having a written constitution is what is the role of the devolved nations in that process? And if you are a Scot, you may well say, the first question for us is, do we join this process at all? Or do we just disappear? And until we've resolved that, it becomes quite difficult to know what to do about involving Scotland in this process of writing a constitution. Are they in or out? You make the same question about Northern Ireland. And, are any of the devolved nations going to be happy with a process which, if it reflects the democratic weight of the different countries, is going to be dominated by England? That is a familiar problem in our constitutional arrangements, which is quite difficult to think how you deal with. If you set up a constitutional assembly, it will have an overwhelming English majority. How do you deal with that? You could have a constitution recommended by 3/4 of it, none of whom were Scots, Welsh, or Northern Irish. So there are these problems. On the other hand, it is the fact that the current devolution settlement is under some pressure and causing all sorts of problems is, of course, one of the reasons why people are thinking about a written constitution. So it cuts both ways. It puts the pressure on to do it, but it also actually makes it much more difficult to do.
You mentioned that you wouldn't ask Eamon de Valera to write it, which is fortunate. Yeah. James, in his question, and I've sort of confused people, that's my fault, by telling them to put the questions in the chat. Of course, they should be in the Q&A, which other people are sensibly doing. James has asked who should write the Constitution. A body appointed by MPs wouldn't involve the great majority of people. A randomly selected group of people wouldn't have any mandate. It has to be an elected constitutional assembly, surely, ?
Yeah, well, that's one of the issues. I mean, I'm actually quite a fan of citizens' assemblies. If some of you may have seen, I just had a piece out today on Labour lists, probably got overwhelmed in the other news, where I suggested one approach to the question of how you introduce a fairer voting system into this country, something which I'm certainly support. It's to have a citizens' assembly. I mean, one advantage of citizens' assemblies, and I mean, in my article talking about electoral reform, I make this point, is that if a citizens' assembly recommends something, and I would hope that it could be persuaded to recommend a system of electoral reform, it can't any longer be plausibly presented as a party fix, which certainly for electoral reform is a real danger, because frankly all parties do think inevitably think, and I've had discussions in the Labour Party where the discussion has been about, does this benefit the Labour Party? Of course you think in those terms. And everybody knows you think in those terms, and the electorate rightly sniffs that you're thinking in those terms. So it's actually better presentationally for all sorts of reasons to have a proposal that isn't the product of a government and therefore one or two parties, but a product of a citizens' assembly composed of people who are not politicians. And hopefully somebody in that assembly will write some form of a case explaining what it is that they've done and why. So I think there's a lot to be said for that. I think how that then relates, and you could imagine a citizens' assembly. I mean, one difficulty is writing a constitution is much more, involves many more questions than just deciding what system of voting you want to have, which is not entirely a simple question, but a relatively straightforward one. Designing a constitution has all sorts of different moving parts that you have to try and think about and all have to make sense in relation to each other. And it's quite an exercise, but I think there is some experience of this working and producing things. Obviously, the Irish have used it again for constitutional amendments on single issues and fairly successfully. So I think it would be worth a try. But I agree. I think it also has to, at some point, sort of connect with some form of elected group of politicians, and ultimately, I think probably most people would agree, would have to be endorsed in some referendum, which again raises the territorial question: would it have to be approved in all 4 nations, or just one? In which case, as in the Brexit referendum, it might just be England that carried the day. So again, one has to, there are questions of design here that are not easy.
If there were to be a citizens' assembly for the UK as a whole to design a constitution for the UK, the citizens' assembly would have to be representative of the UK as a whole. Can you see that would be an answer, or do you think that for the devolved nations that would still be seen to be too England-centric?
Well, I'm English and not Scottish or Welsh, but I'm pretty sure that, well, I mean, I know what the SNP line on this is going to be, and at the moment that's a party that represents just under half of Scottish voters. I think the Welsh, I think there would be real concerns, and even in Wales and Scotland. The problem of disproportionate numbers is just so enormous that they would have a real concern that their particular issues and concerns was just lost in an assembly that was 80 to 85% English, which it would be if you had it as if it reflected the share of the population as a whole. I mean, I think this is just an issue. I don't think there's the right answer to it, but I think anyone who's proposing, either an elected assembly, constitutional assembly, constituent assembly, or a citizens' assembly has to grapple with this. Of how you deal with the fact that you've got in the United Kingdom 4 nations. I say that with slight hesitation because I'm not quite sure how to refer to Northern Ireland, but certainly 4 distinct jurisdictions, to use a more lawyerly term, with very much their own interests and concerns, but with one which is overwhelmingly dominant in population terms. It is a real design problem, and there isn't, unfortunately, any real example of a functioning federal or quasi-federal system where that is true. And the closest you get to is Second Reich Germany between 1870 and, well, also the Weimar Republic up until Hitler's, where you had Prussia as an overwhelmingly dominant state. That's not an entirely happy model for anybody to follow. And it did create considerable problems, less so under the Second Reich, because that was not really a democracy, but certainly under Weimar, the fact that Prussia was so overwhelmingly as the dominant state meant that you had this problem of how the Prussian government related to the German government, which was, and there were other problems, of course, but one of the problems that bedeviled Weimar Germany. And so there isn't really any a book to work off. I mean, you can obviously one idea is sort of divide England up, but as soon as you start saying that, you get the horrible question of into what. There are some parts of England that one can pretty sensibly see as fairly coherent regional units with a distinct identity, but even Cornwall, perhaps the most obvious. But the rest of it, even the ones that are pretty powerful in their identity, have rather uncertain borders, Yorkshire, and others are a bit the southeast. God knows what that consists of. Does it include London? What really does Oxford have in common with Kent? I mean, it's tricky.
I referred earlier to the Chilean approach. Do you think we've got much to learn from that? This is Muthia's question. Does that provide us a route map? Obviously, it doesn't address the devolved nations issue that you've referred to, but in terms of public involvement, the process there involved an election process, which ended up electing a platform of people who were not the usual suspects in terms of being politicians, and they've now embarked on a process of refreshing their constitution. Do you see that perhaps as providing a way forward?
Yeah, I mean, I confess to being no expert at all on Chile, and I haven't sort of followed what's been going on there particularly closely, other than, I mean, I know more or less what Tom just reminded me of in the question. One feature of Chile, of course, is that it already has a written constitution. It has a constitution left to it by Pinochet, and one of the, as I understand it, one of the things that has led to a view that you needed a new constitution was simply that constitution, which after all imposed on Chile by a former dictator, had lost, and it was no longer acceptable for all sorts of reasons to do with the protection of the position of the military and ability to go back and look at what had happened during the various crimes of the Pinochet era and various other issues. So, I say I don't know much about the Chilean situation, but it's a different one from ours. I mean, whatever you can say about our constitution, and you can be rude about it, it wasn't imposed on us by a dictator. It sort of emerged over time, and partly through processes that are deeply democratic in the end, certainly, or sort of heading that way. The whole sort of controversy of the 17th century, and then the sort of the movement to expand the franchise during the 19th century and so on. So, it's the sort of democratic legitimacy of our constitution is just much greater.
Peter Davidson, in one of his questions, has asked whether you envisage a role for a citizens' convention. So we've got the possibility of a constitutional convention, which is perhaps what happened with McLennan, for instance, got McLennan, citizens' conventions, citizens' assembly. How do you see all of these things functioning? And do you have a preference, or is it a combination of those?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I think I need a bit of definition as to what the difference between the citizens' convention and the citizens' assembly was. I'm sure.
Well, I'll read out what Peter has said.
Yeah.
So, what role do you envisage for a citizens' convention? Open brackets, a UK-wide constitutional convention founded on a citizens' assembly platform. Close brackets. I don't know whether that provides the clarity that you wanted.
Yes, well, so sort of indirectly elected convention of some form. Yeah, I mean, the sort of romantic civic republican me does, really does rather like the idea of groups of ordinary citizens, or a group of ordinary citizens getting together with inevitably some degree of support and guidance. I mean, they need secretarial support apart from anything else, but also I think lots of people come and talk to them, and trying to work out the way in which we should be governed, and then that process being put to a democratic vote. I mean, I think in terms of legitimacy and democratic legitimacy, and in terms of getting people to to educate and inform themselves about politics and about important questions which are important to everybody's lives, all the things that civic Republicans tend to regard as rather important, that the process of politics is a thing that people should get involved in because it's ultimately the only way in which legitimately things can be managed, and it's also morally, ideally, better for people than just sitting and being told what to do. All these various claims I believe in, and that points me in the direction of something like a citizens' assembly. I just think it's quite difficult to see how in today's United Kingdom you get it off the ground to do a grand project. I mean, it might be, to trumpet my own suggestion today, it may be that, as a matter of those of us who want to go down this road, that perhaps a sort of initial step is sort of baby steps, is to suggest citizens' conventions as a way of dealing with particular problems, such as my suggestion of getting it to deal with the voting system. You can imagine other things that it might deal with, and the Irish example. And once people have got familiar with that as a mechanism, perhaps having something rather wider, sort of bit incremental.
You mentioned earlier the Irish sort of constitution is, and this is Rosalind Kent's question, do you think that the island has a good, sort of simple, well-functioning example of a constitution?
Yeah, I'm actually quite an admirer of the Irish constitution. It has it has its old history. I remember when I first read it, which I did, from beginning to end, which I did when I was having to do a constitutional law paper to qualify for the Irish bar. I read it beginning to end, and the opening words are, "In the name of the Most Holy Trinity," and the name of Jesus Christ, in whose name our forefathers struggled, or something like that. But this is not a usual opening to a constitution. It's not "We the People." So it has, as originally written, it had things that were obviously, simply not something we would do, like leading over the Catholic Church and some rather odd provisions of religion. It still has some odd corners. There's a clause that I like to embarrass my Irish friends with, which still proclaims that it's the duty of the state to honour the role of woman as the founder of the family and the maker of the home. I think they are finally planning to get rid of that one. There's also a whole set of social and economic rights which are profoundly influenced by Catholic social thought. No word apart from the role of women stuff, no worse for that in some ways. In practice, they've never really been live parts of the constitution because the courts have always found, for reasons familiar to anyone who's sort of looked at some of the problems with sort of social and economic rights, is that there's a question of how you enforce them in a situation where what you're really doing is telling the state to spend lots of money, and courts are, for various good institutional reasons, rather nervous about doing that. So those provisions have never got off the ground. But it has worked. It has been, like all constitutions, when you read it, read its history, you learn quite a lot about the modern history of Ireland and the way in which it seems to have helped. It will reflect, resolve, sometimes exacerbate, because things haven't, particularly on the abortion, things haven't gone well. The courts took some rather odd decisions on abortion. And then there was the constitutional amendment. So, it swings and roundabouts, but I think by and large it's worked well. One of the things I think is good is that it's relatively easy to change in a process that the Irish people seem now to be very familiar with and take quite seriously. So even sometimes quite technical changes on the constitution get a reasonable airing, a reasonable amount of discussion, and then there's a vote that probably reflects some sort of sensible outcome of rational debate. There are some oddities about that. They have a rule that you have to have 50-50 representation on all TV debates with in relation to some constitutional amendments, which are really essentially uncontroversial, is a bit odd, so that you end up with rather odd groups making up the 50% time with very peculiar reasons for resisting a change. So there are some oddities, but it by and large I think it's a good thing. It's certainly preferable to the the opposite end, where the American situation, where it's completely impossible to change the constitution in practice, which means you end up the only way of changing the constitution is to pack the Supreme Court, with all the problems that leads to. And I think it's probably better than models, because it involves the people, than models where, like the German constitution, where you need a 2/3 majority in the Bundestag, and I think the Bundesrat also to change the constitution with no popular involvement at all. But then Germany has a history of being extremely distrustful of referendums for reasons that are obvious. So I tend to prefer a referendum, and I think the way the Irish have done it has worked quite well, and they seem to be quite used to it and do it well. And it's a good example because they started, obviously, because Ireland came out of British constitutional history, having been having been part of the Westminster system for over 100 years. It's quite there are all sorts of it's a in the way in which they deal with the relationship between the legislature and the executive, and the legislative of the courts and so on. It's got some quite interesting ideas that would fit quite well into our model, because it arises out of our model, and therefore is perhaps rather more interesting than models such as France or Germany or America, which are more unusual, which are based on a very different history, constitutional history, or even Canada and Australia, that of course are sort of deeply federal in the way that, subject to devolution, we're not, although that's one of our issues.
It's not a question, I suppose it's a challenge from Claire Hill in the chat, and that some of the discussion that we're having is very theoretical. And I guess probably on this call, there's perhaps half of the people attending who are really interested in the looking at the detail of how a constitution is constructed, and perhaps the other half who are interested from perhaps a campaigning practical point of view. How do we actually make, and this is a challenge for us as an organisation, Unlock Democracy, how do we make the need for a constitution something that is relevant to people in terms of their ability to access NHS care, concerns they might have about funding of their local school, or crime on the street. So can you think of any ways in which we can demonstrate that a constitution isn't an academic theoretical thing of interest to academics with a couple of decades of experience, but actually has practical implications for people in their daily lives?
Yeah, I mean, I think one example is the whole issue of levelling up. I mean, I think one of the reasons that so many parts, particularly of England, feel disconnected from central government. So I say central government rather than London, because actually quite large parts of London, I mean, I live in one in Hackney, feel pretty disconnected from central government at the moment too. So it's not just a question of geography. But I think one of the reasons why that has happened is that the English system of local government is entirely the creature of Westminster. It always has been, and for the last N years has been vulnerable, constantly vulnerable to whims from the party in power, usually grabbing power, because that's what Westminster does, or sometimes grabbing power and trying to decentralise responsibility, which is another thing Westminster does, and was particularly, sorry, I'm now sounding slightly more partisan, but it's distinctly the case during the coalition government with austerity, where the reason why the cuts fell most heavily on local government was precisely because that government wanted to centralise power and decentralise accountability. So local government would get blamed for stuff that central government was doing. And that one of the major attacks on local government happened during the Thatcher era, when that was largely centred on local government funding. And the end result of the poll tax debacle and all the rest of it was that virtually all local authority funding, up to an enormous proportion that is ludicrously higher than any other system of local government anywhere in Western Europe, is essentially handouts from central government. because local government raises so little of its own revenue. It's got this ridiculous tax base of council tax and nothing else. A few other bits and pieces. So you've got, and one of the reasons that happens is that there is simply no constitutional protection at all for local government. So it's constantly being kicked for base political reasons, I'd say sometimes on both sides, and sort of general tendency of Westminster to ratchet power towards itself. Now, if you actually want to try and stop that, I mean, that is ultimately a constitutional question. If you want to try and set up a system of local government that functions as well and has the stable ability, has a stable ability to raise money and to plan for decades into the future, which is what you want local government to do, and what in countries, particularly like Germany, it can do, you've got to try and make it difficult for Westminster to fiddle around with it all the time. And the only way of doing that is to have some form of entrenchment, some way of, sorry. I apologize for that. My phone rang and it's been cut into my iPad. It's constitutional change. And anyway, if you're talking about devolution, you are talking proper devolution. You are talking about constitutional change. I mean, I think it's if you can put constitutional change in terms of giving your local mayor, or having a local mayor, or a local council. I'm no particular admirer of mayors, but they do seem to be the flavour of the moment. But if your local mayor or your local assembly, giving them real power, real budgets, real tax base, which is they can use to plan 20 years into the future, and that the way of doing that is, you don't have to call it constitutional change, you just say that's what you want to do. That might be a way of selling constitutional change. I think you need, there's always I'm a lawyer, so I have to, aware of there's always danger of just sounding too lawyerly about all of this stuff. I think you do have to try and sell constitutional change in ways that that gets pretty quickly to the answer, why does this matter to me, living my ordinary life and perhaps not desperately interested in politics, because most people are not.
Yes, and I wonder whether the choice of local government as a means of demonstrating that constitutions matter, people don't have that positive a relationship with their local authorities either. I wonder whether we need to find those examples that do actually link to things like the NHS to really make this cut through in a way that would land with people.
Yeah, I mean, possibly. I mean, yeah, I mean, I think that's right. I mean, how can you relate constitutional reform to the NHS? Well, again, part of the problem with the NHS has been constant reorganisation. Down to Lansley, that, in my view, has probably been pretty damaging. You could certainly, I mean, one of the things that would almost certainly happen in any British debate, and that's probably the point one can cheerfully talk about British rather than English, any British debate on the Constitution, is that the NHS would probably be in it somewhere. I've always thought that the two obvious things to put in a British Bill of Rights that weren't in the convention are trial by jury, which the government is sort of waving towards, but it's actually slightly tricky because most people don't actually get trial by jury as it stands. So how do you make it a right? But the other thing was some form of, right to free healthcare at the point of need. I mean, I think if you've got any group of citizens to do a list of rights, that would be in there, probably along with right to education certainly up to end of secondary school and probably beyond, and probably some other things as well, but certainly health. If you could then constitutionalize the NHS in some way, that might, well, I mean, you have to think about, there might be arguments for and against that. It might make it more difficult because sometimes it does need reform of various kinds. You don't want to frustrate reform that would actually be quite a good idea from whichever part of the spectrum you come from, but you might also want to protect it against, death literally by 1,000 cuts, which is to some extent what's happened. I mean, those are discussions, I think, which sometimes I don't think are foregrounded enough when people talk about the Constitution, is you can really discuss things that are important to people: protection of local services, protection of the NHS, as well as more abstract stuff like the relationship between Parliament and the executive, which is, I don't demean its importance, profoundly important, but probably is less immediately germane to most people who aren't interested in this stuff.
That was a point that that relationship with the executive was a point that Catherine Bearder made in an earlier question, that if we had a written constitution, what would it say about getting rid of the Prime Minister?
Well, yeah, that's a lively question. Well, I mean, I think one thing it probably would do, and actually I think there's something to be said for this, you don't actually need a written constitution to do it. You could just have an act of parliament, which actually formalises the process of appointing a prime minister. There were, in Ireland, for example, there is a formal process. You actually, the prime minister has to be positively approved by a vote of the Oireachtas before. I can't remember immediately after or immediately before taking office, but certainly at the time of taking office. So you get a sort of endorsement. We don't actually have that in our system. I mean, our system is that the Crown appoints the Prime Minister, who is supposed then normally to resign or at least call a general election if they lose a vote of no confidence. But there's no sort of, the Parliament doesn't actually elect the Prime Minister in the way that it elects the Speaker, for example. And the House of Commons doesn't. Sorry, the House of Commons doesn't elect the Prime Minister the way that it elects the Speaker, and it might be quite good to have that. Whether it would make that much difference, I don't know, but it would, I think, would be quite. It would be, I think, a sort of nicely symbolic of the, of what I think certainly ought to be the case, that the Prime Minister is accountable primarily to the Commons than to the monarch. In terms of getting rid of a Prime Minister, well, that's sort of rather conflated with getting rid of the government, which is the first past the post, the Fixed Term Parliaments Act, which it hasn't proved to be. I mean, I think it's, I don't think it's as bad as it's sometimes painted to be, and I don't think it's to blame for much of the sort of Brexit constitutional crisis that we got into. But it's still not a perfect piece of legislation, and it does leave some questions, very murky. Such as what happens if you pass a vote of no confidence in the government in a way that it doesn't quite meet the terms of the laid down in the Act, which became a rather live question during the later days of the 1719 Parliament. And that's all a bit of a mess. So, I mean, in terms of getting rid of at the moment, the position is that you could imagine a motion to reduce the Prime Minister's salary, which is a technical way of attacking a particular minister, or you just have a no confidence motion, but of course it wouldn't pass, which of course is the political problem.
A couple more questions. So a question which came in, the first question that I received, which was from Marisha Ray before the event started, and that is, what role do you see a constitution playing in addressing inequality, marginalisation issues?
Well, I mean, that's a huge question. Obviously, one feature of most human rights charters is that they do that, often in slow and incremental ways, but it does provide a way of protection for some marginalized groups, and a way in which some marginalized groups can get political attention to, at the very least, to certain issues, and on occasion get a correction of rules that may have been passed without paying them any proper attention. So I think human rights charters play part of that. as a supporter of electoral reform, I think electoral reform would help. I think one of the problems in our current political system caused by our voting system is that in large parts of the country, most people's votes, but people's votes don't matter, and they know it. People aren't fools. And that breeds a certain cynicism, both, I think, among the parties, that I don't think it's good for parties to have safe seats. Some MPs for safe seats are absolutely wonderful. I happen to think mine is, but a lot aren't, and you can get away with an awful lot in a safe seat that you couldn't in a marginal, in terms of attention or disappearing off to the Caribbean to spend 6 months, rather than attending to your needs for your constituents, mentioning no names. And that is less likely to happen in a system where you have MPs are all potentially vulnerable and all have to think about every vote, and also to appeal to different sectors. Again, I think some MPs are quite genuinely try work hard for all their constituents, even the ones who didn't vote for them. But it is a temptation, if you've got a majority of 20,000, just only to pay attention to the ones who voted for you. And that happens. And then if you're not one of those, you feel marginalized. And of course, some groups find it really very difficult to get representation at all. And I also think PR, it helps in terms of securing, appropriate proportions of women and ethnic minorities and other sections of the population, which is much more difficult to achieve under first past the post. So I don't think I'm going to have much dissent from this audience from that view. What else can a written constitution do? I think more numinously. One of the reasons I think for quite liking the idea of a citizens' assembly and of a participative process of designing a constitution is it isn't just symbolic, but it is a question involving all citizens, the poorest he as well as the greatest he, to use the great level of phrase. And of course, these days one would add she, or they and they, to that mix. But it's, that's one of the reasons I think it's a good thing. And I think it would have an effect in getting people to think of themselves as citizens of a republic with a small r, because I don't really much care if you keep the monarchy as a symbol, but as a republic with a small r, where we're all citizens instead of subjects, grateful for what we happen to have, our ancestors have happened to leave us. I think that would be quite good for the way in which people think about themselves. And there's entirely respectable and long-running strand of English political thought that gets you that direction. You don't need to go to the continent.
Thank you. Now, perhaps what might have to be the last question, I'm afraid, and this has been asked by a number of people, including Nigel Jones, and you've sort of referred to it, and that is whether we're not trying to, in effect, bite off far too big a chunk, and that aren't there different ways of dealing with this in stages, for instance, trying to tackle, Catherine Bidder suggested, local government, picking off individual issues and resolving them. And I know that your view is that trying to tackle this as a whole would be challenging. We should, in fact, partition off certain parts of the Constitution and give it perhaps extra safeguards. So could we do this in a sort of salami slicing way instead of trying to deal with this in one big Chilean-style review and implementation?
It may be. I've certainly, I suggest electoral reform. I think another issue, which is, I think, for reasons I think I've become clear from what I've already said, I think may just need to be sorted out first, is the whole question of the relationship between the different territorial bits of the United Kingdom. And I think one approach to that is to set out, one of the problems, the constitutional problems we've got, is because of unfettered Westminster sovereignty, no matter how much you write in declarations into the Scotland Act and the Government of Wales Act that these are permanent arrangements and should not be challenged without a referendum, and all the other, and that Westminster will not normally legislate for those areas in devolved competences without their consent, both of which are written in to those statutes, sort of aspirational declarations, but without any legal force whatsoever. If you were to try and give that sort of sentiment, that sort of thing, legal force, you would have to entrench, because you've got to put it beyond the power of a government elected for 5 years, largely on English votes, with a majority of, well, if you don't change the electoral system, potentially, a majority of 80 on the back of about 45% of the vote. It's vulnerable to that. Now, the only way you can protect it is some form of entrenchment. Do you need a Westminster Constitution to do that? Not necessarily. Do you need a written constitution to do that? Not necessarily. There are, for example, if you look at Australia, the Australia constitution contains various provisions that can only be changed by a 2/3 majority of the House of Commons. So you could imagine a territorial settlement, a devolution settlement that really deserved the name of a settlement, something that was intended to be settled rather than a sort of moving picture, which really protected the powers of the Scottish and the Scottish Parliament and the Senate against encroachment by Westminster, and that could be protected by a 2/3 majority vote requirement in the House of Commons. And if you had an upper house that was in some way more representative of the nations and regions, which I think people are thinking about, you could require that it got a huge proportion of the vote there too. So effectively, that would be entrenched without you having to have a written constitution. Australia does have a written constitution, but you don't actually need to have one to do that. You just put it into legislation. You essentially sort of change the composition of the parliament that is needed to decide certain questions. So that's one approach. But I think if one's going to go down, if one's going to go down a process of constitutional reform in this country, it is going to be incremental and short of some national trauma that I hope we don't have. And I think, the territorial issue is one that's going to come first. It may, of course, be sorted by Scotland deciding that it's going to become independent, in which case England and Wales are going to have to sort out how they're going to relate to each other and the different bits of England. But that seems to me to be almost a sort of prior question. Partly because until you have some sense of what nation you actually are and how the different bits of it relate to each other, territorial bits of it relate to each other, you can't really then move on to the next stage, which is how, as that nation, whatever it is, do we want to be governed?
I think that's a very good point on which to finish. Clearly, we do need to work out what sort of a nation we are and how the different components hang together. So thank you very much, George, for your time and your invaluable insights. Can I apologise to the many people? We probably had at least 40 additional questions that could have been posed. And I apologise for the fact we didn't have time to put those to you. I would say there will be another opportunity soon for constitutional matters to be debated again, and hopefully we'll be able to take more questions then. But thank you, George. Any last words you'd like to leave with us before? No, before we close? Thank you for listening to me, and thank you for all your very interesting questions. I'm sorry I didn't get a chance to answer them. I'm not promising anything, but I do have an account on Twitter, and if you ping something at me, I might, depending on whether I pick it up or how busy I am, respond to it. But if you so that's one way of getting in touch with me if you want to raise anything with me. Well, thank you very much, George, and thank you everyone else for joining us and for your questions. And good night, and enjoy the rest of your evening. Thank you, everybody.